pen and paper used to be harmless, but for a lonely woman in Chicago pouring her heart out to an inmate turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse. She thought she was comforting a lost soul. She was actually giving a ruthless cartel boss a map to her doorstep. Loneliness had a specific sound for Kaylee Turner. It was the hum of the ancient radiator in her cramped apartment on Lincoln Avenue and the quiet scratching of her own pen against heavy cardstock. At 26, Kaylee lived a life buried in the past. As a junior archivist at the Newberry Library, she spent her days cataloguing forgotten historical documents and her nights trying to forget her own history. Her father, Arthur Turner, had died suddenly a year prior in a fiery car crash on the outskirts of the city. The police ruled it a tragic accident, a patch of black ice and a steep embankment. Kaylee was left with nothing but a handful of his old possessions and a hollow ache in her chest. Desperate for a connection that didn't involve pitying looks from her co-workers, Kaylee stumbled upon a localized rehabilitation initiative called Second Chance Letters. It was a pen pal program designed to offer emotional support to non-violent offenders nearing the end of their sentences. The brochure promised that simple human kindness could reform a life. Kaylee signed up on a rainy Tuesday. 3 weeks later, she received her first letter from Inmate 849, 2-B, Stateville Correctional Center. His name, he wrote, was Leo Rossi. Leo's handwriting was an immediate shock. It wasn't the crude, hurried scrawl she had anticipated. It was elegant, leaning slightly to the right, written with the steady, measured hand of a man who commanded patience. His first letter was brief but poetic. He didn't offer excuses for his incarceration, claiming only that he was paying a necessary debt for administrative misjudgments. Instead, he asked about the world outside. He asked what the wind felt like, coming off Lake Michigan in the autumn. Kaylee replied eagerly. She described the golden hues of the trees in Millennium Park, the smell of roasted nuts on the street corners, and the quiet sanctuary of the library. Before long, their correspondence deepened into a profound, intimate exchange. Kaylee found herself waiting by the mailbox, her heart doing a nervous flutter whenever she saw the stark, stamped envelopes from Stateville. She poured her soul onto the pages. She told Leo about her father Arthur, a quiet accountant who worked long hours and kept to himself. She confessed her deep-seated fear that she would die as anonymously as the people whose diaries she preserved at work. Leo's responses were intoxicatingly perceptive. He validated her grief. He wrote paragraphs analyzing her favorite literature, his words dripping with a dark, captivating charisma. "You are not anonymous, Kaylee," he wrote in a letter dated late November. "You are simply waiting for the right pair of eyes to read you." She fell in love. It was foolish, dangerous, and entirely consuming. She loved a man made of ink and carefully chosen words. What Kaylee did not know, what the naive archivist could not possibly fathom, was that Leo Rossi did not exist. The man holding the pen in the solitary confinement wing of Stateville was Lincoln Falcone. Lincoln was not a non-violent offender, nor was he seeking redemption. He was the undisputed head of the Falcone crime syndicate, a multi-million-dollar empire built on extortion, illegal arms, and racketeering. He had been incarcerated on a temporary, trumped-up tax evasion charge, while the district attorney desperately tried to build a RICO case against him. Lincoln ruled his empire from the inside out, guarded by corrupt wardens and feared by the general population. And Lincoln was hunting. Before his death, Arthur Turner had not been a simple, quiet accountant. He had been the Falcone family's chief money launderer. Arthur had grown a conscience, or perhaps just a spine, and had attempted to flee with a heavily encrypted flash drive containing the offshore routing numbers for Lincoln's entire fortune, nearly $60 million in untraceable funds. Lincoln's men had intercepted Arthur on that icy road, running his sedan off the embankment. But the drive was missing. Lincoln had spent the last year scouring the city for it. When he discovered Arthur had a daughter, he needed a way into her life, a way into her mind. The second chance. Letter's program was a calculated farce, orchestrated by his expensive lawyers to bypass the prison's monitored communication channels. While Kaylee wept tears of romantic longing over his beautiful letters, Lincoln sat in his immaculate, contraband-filled cell, coldly extracting data from her words. "I keep all my father's things in a locked trunk at the foot of my bed," she had written in December. Lincoln had smirked, handing the letter to a corrupt guard to be copied and sent to his lieutenants. She was handing him the keys to her sanctuary, completely unaware that the man kissing the end of the letters with an elegant L was the very same monster who had ordered her father's execution. Spring arrived in Chicago, thawing the ice and bringing a nervous electric energy to Kaylee's small apartment. The letters had culminated in a joyous announcement Leo was being released on parole. Due to overcrowding and exemplary behavior, his sentence had been commuted. They had agreed to meet on a Thursday afternoon at a quiet, unpretentious diner in the West Loop called the Silver Spoon. Kaylee spent hours preparing. She bought a new dress, a soft emerald green, that brought out the color of her eyes, and curled her hair with trembling hands. She carried a bundle of his letters in her purse, a talisman of the emotional bond they had forged over the grueling winter. She arrived at the diner 20 minutes early, ordering a black coffee and watching the door. Every time the bell chimed, her breath hitched. A delivery driver, an elderly couple, a group of college students. The minutes crawled into hours. The waitress offered sympathetic knowing glances as she refilled Kaylee's cold mug. By the time the sun began to dip below the city skyline, casting long, mournful shadows across the diner floor, the reality set in. Leo wasn't coming. He had walked out of the prison gates and directly out of her life. The romance had been a coping mechanism for him, a prison fantasy that evaporated the moment he tasted fresh air. Tears burning her eyes, Kaylee paid the bill and walked out into the crisp evening air, her heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She took the train back to Lincoln Avenue, moving like a ghost. When she unlocked her apartment door, the space felt colder than usual. She dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door and kicked off her heels. It wasn't until she walked into her bedroom that the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It was subtle, the kind of disturbance only a woman who lived alone would notice. Her closet door was open a fraction of an inch more than she usually left it. The stack of books on her nightstand was perfectly aligned, whereas she always left them haphazardly stacked. And the heavy oak trunk at the foot of her bed, the one containing her father's belongings, had a microscopic scratch near the brass lock. Kaylee approached it slowly, her pulse thumping in her ears. She unlocked it. Inside her father's old jackets, his collection of vintage vinyl, and his worn leather briefcase seemed untouched. But the stale, distinctly metallic scent of expensive cologne lingered in the trapped air of the room. Someone had been here. Someone had searched her life while she was sitting in a diner waiting for a ghost. Panicked, she called the police. 2 tired patrol officers arrived, took a brief look around, and dismissively suggested her landlord might have done an unannounced maintenance check, or that her grief and recent heartbreak were making her paranoid. Nothing was stolen, they reasoned. There was no crime to report. The next few weeks were a haze of paranoia and depression. Kaylee changed her locks, installed a cheap security camera, and buried herself in her archival work. She tried to forget Leo Rossi. It was on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after the diner incident, that her world tilted on its axis again. Kaylee was at a high-end charity gala hosted by the library. She was standing near a display of 18th-century maps, sipping cheap champagne, and desperately wishing she was at home. The cartography of the 1700s always fascinates me, a deep, resonant voice said from beside her. They spent so much time drawing the edges of the world simply because they were terrified of what they couldn't see. Kaylee turned and felt the air vanish from her lungs. The man standing next to her was breathtakingly handsome, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed old money and dangerous power. He had dark, sweeping hair, piercing amber eyes, and a sharp, aristocratic jawline. He exuded an aura of total command, parting the crowded room around him, simply by existing. I agree," Kaylee stammered, caught completely off guard by his intensity. He offered a devastating, slow smile. "I'm Enzo Castiglione. I'm a private collector here to make a donation to the Historical Preservation Fund." "Kaylee Turner," she replied, shaking his outstretched hand. His grip was firm, his skin warm, but there was a roughness to his calluses that didn't match his billionaire exterior. "A pleasure, Kaylee." Lincoln's amber eyes locked onto hers, analyzing her with predatory precision. He had bypassed the apartment sweep his men had failed to find, the drive in the trunk, meaning Arthur had hidden it far more cleverly than anticipated. Lincoln realized he couldn't just tear her apartment apart. He needed Kaylee to lead him to it. He needed to play a new character. Over the next 2 hours, Lincoln wove a masterful web. He was charming, attentive, and incredibly intelligent. He asked about her work, her passions, and smoothly maneuvered the conversation into personal territory. Kaylee, still fragile from her phantom pen pal's abandonment, found herself irresistibly drawn to this wealthy, magnetic stranger. He felt surprisingly safe. He felt familiar. "You have a sadness about you, Kaylee," Lincoln murmured later that evening, standing close enough that she could smell his cologne. Her breath hitched. It was a rich, metallic scent, the exact same scent she had smelled in her bedroom. But before her brain could make the terrifying connection, his deep voice distracted her. "Who hurt you?" Against her better judgment, the dam broke. I made a mistake," she confessed softly, staring at her champagne flute. "I fell for someone I never really knew. A pen pal. He was supposed to meet me and he just vanished." Lincoln's expression morphed into a perfect mask of sympathetic outrage. Internally, a cold smirk curled around his thoughts. "What kind of a coward?" Lincoln whispered, stepping closer, reaching out to gently tuck a stray curl behind her ear. "Would ever abandon a woman like you?" The physical touch sent a jolt of electricity down her spine. It was foolish. He was an inmate. I thought he had changed. "People rarely change, Kaylee," Lincoln said softly, his amber eyes darkening. "They just get better at hiding who they really are." Over the next week, Enzo flooded her life. He sent extravagant bouquets of rare lilies to her desk at the library. He took her to dimly lit exclusive restaurants where waiters trembled when they poured his wine. He was intoxicating. Yet beneath the velvet romance, the hunt continued. Lincoln was mapping every corner of her mind, probing for memories of her father, subtly asking about Arthur's final days, his habits, his keepsakes. One evening after a dinner date, it began to rain heavily. Lincoln insisted on escorting her up to her apartment to ensure she got inside safely. It was the first time he had stepped foot inside the apartment, at least as Enzo. Cozy. He lied smoothly, his eyes instantly scanning the layout, confirming the details his men had mapped out weeks ago. He took off his heavy trench coat, shaking off the rainwater. "Do you mind if I dry this off?" "Not at all. Let me hang it in the bathroom," Kaylee said, taking the heavy, expensive garment from him. As she carried it down the narrow hall, she felt something stiff in the inner breast pocket. Thinking it was a wallet that might fall out, she reached inside. Her fingers brushed against a thick piece of folded cardstock. She pulled it out. It was an envelope. Kaylee froze. The air in the hallway seemed to turn to ice. The envelope bore the official, unmistakable stamp of the Stateville Correctional Center mailroom. But it wasn't the stamp that made Kaylee's heart stop. It was the handwriting on the front, elegantly slanted, leaning slightly to the right. The measured, patient cursive that had haunted her dreams for months. It was addressed to Mr. Lincoln Falcone, but the handwriting belonged to Leo Rossi. Her hands began to shake violently. She stared at the coat, then at the envelope, the pieces of the puzzle violently smashing together in her mind. The break-in, the metallic cologne, the stranger who had seemingly fallen out of the sky with an intense interest in her life. From the living room, Lincoln's dark, resonant voice called out, stripping away the illusion forever. "Did you find something interesting, Kaylee?" Panic clawed at her throat, sharp and suffocating. Kaylee shoved the envelope back into the inner pocket of the bespoke Brioni trench coat, her hands trembling so violently she could barely smooth the fabric down. The pieces of the puzzle were no longer just assembling themselves. They were choking her. Leo Rossi was a phantom. The man sitting on her velvet sofa, casually sipping the pour-over coffee she had just made, was Lincoln Falcone. Even buried in the dusty archives of the Newberry Library, Kaylee had seen enough front-page Chicago Tribune headlines to know exactly who the Falcone family was. They were ghosts, wrapped in expensive suits, a syndicate notorious for bleeding the city's underground dry through racketeering narcotics and sudden violent disappearances. And the kingpin was in her apartment, asking if she had found something interesting. "Just checking the label," Kaylee called back, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. She gripped the edge of the bathroom sink, staring at her pale reflection in the mirror. She had to survive this. She took a deep, shuddering breath, pasted a casual smile on her face, and walked back into the living room. Lincoln was sitting with his legs crossed, resting his arm along the back of the sofa. The dim light of the floor lamp caught the edge of his jaw and the heavy silver face of the Patek Philippe Nautilus watch on his wrist. He looked entirely relaxed, but his amber eyes were entirely too still, tracking her every movement like a hawk watching a field mouse. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice, a low, soothing baritone that now sounded like a threat. "Fine," Kaylee lied smoothly, sitting in the armchair opposite him. "Just tired from the event." Lincoln didn't blink. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, suppressed Glock 19, placing it gently onto her glass coffee table. The heavy metallic clunk echoed in the small apartment like a thunderclap. Kaylee froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You're a terrible liar, Kaylee," Lincoln said softly. The charming, wealthy benefactor named Enzo vanished in an instant, replaced by the cold, calculating apex predator of the Chicago underworld. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You found the envelope. I instructed my lawyers to intercept my mail, but it seems one slipped through. Careless of them. Careless of me." "You," Kaylee whispered, pressing her back against the armchair. "You wrote those letters. You made me fall in love with a ghost. I did what was necessary to get inside your head." Lincoln corrected his tone, devoid of any empathy. "Your father was a very intelligent man, Kaylee. Arthur was my chief accountant. He laundered $50 million of my money through shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, and then he decided he wanted a quiet retirement. He stole a highly encrypted flash drive containing the master routing numbers. My money, Kaylee." Tears pricked her eyes, mourning the image of the quiet, honest father she thought she knew. He died in a car crash. He died because he refused to give up the drive when my men ran him off Lake Shore Drive, Lincoln corrected coldly. I spent a year rotting in a cell on a tax charge while my lawyers tore the city apart looking for it. When we couldn't find it in his office, I knew he must have left it with the only thing he cared about. You. I don't have it, she choked out. I swear to God, Lincoln, I don't know what you're talking about. Lincoln stood up slowly, towering over her. You wrote to Leo that you kept all of his things in a trunk. My men searched it. Nothing. But a man like Arthur wouldn't just throw $50 million in a trunk. He hid it, and he left you a map, a clue. Something only his archivist daughter would understand. Think, Kaylee. Think very carefully, because if you can't remember, you are of absolutely no use to me. Her mind raced, cycling through her father's final days. The last time she saw him, they had met for lunch near the Art Institute. He had seemed nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder. He had given her a birthday gift a month early, a battered first-edition copy of Great Expectations. A classic for my classic girl, he had said. Keep it safe. The ending is different than you think. Kaylee swallowed hard. A book, she whispered. He gave me a book before he died. A first edition of Charles Dickens. Lincoln's eyes flared with a dark, triumphant light. Where is it? It's not here, she said, quickly realizing her only leverage was keeping the location a secret. It's highly valuable. I keep it in my climate-controlled locker at the library. You need me to get past the security desk. Lincoln stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, calculating the risk. Finally, he picked up the weapon from the coffee table and slipped it back into his holster. Get your coat, Kaylee. We are going to the library. And if you even think about alerting the security guard, I will shoot him in the head before he can reach for his radio. Do you understand? She nodded numbly. The rain lashed against the windshield of Lincoln's black SUV as they drove through the deserted streets of downtown Chicago. Lincoln's lieutenant, a heavily scarred man named Dominic, drove in total silence. Kaylee sat in the back, Lincoln practically pinning her against the door, his presence suffocating. She felt the cold, hard press of his gun against her ribs through her coat. She needed a plan. The Newberry Library was a fortress of rare documents, and at 2 a.m. it would be empty, except for the night watchman, an elderly man named Stan. She couldn't let Lincoln kill him. More importantly, she realized something crucial: her father hadn't just stolen the money. If Arthur was smart enough to hide $50 million, he was smart enough to keep leverage. That flash drive didn't just contain routing numbers. It likely contained the entire ledger of the Falcone Syndicate's criminal enterprises, political bribes, and blood money. The SUV pulled up to the darkened service entrance of the library. Lincoln grabbed her by the arm, his grip bruising. Nice and easy, Kaylee. Swipe your badge. She approached the keypad with trembling fingers. She swiped her keycard, and the heavy iron door clicked open. They stepped into the dimly lit, cavernous halls of the archive sector. The air smelled of old paper leather and dust. "Where's the guard?" Lincoln whispered sharply. "Front desk on the other side of the building," she replied quietly. "The employee lockers are down in the sub-basement." With Dominic trailing behind them, his hand inside his jacket, they descended the concrete stairwell. Kaylee's mind was working frantically. The sub-basement wasn't just where her locker was. It was where the library's automated high-density shelving system was housed massive motorized steel shelves on tracks that could crush a person if they were caught between them. "Locker 42, Kaylee said, pointing down the narrow aisle of grey metal doors. "Open it," Lincoln commanded, stepping back to give her space, though he kept his weapon drawn and aimed squarely at her spine. Kaylee dialed the combination, her hands slick with sweat. The locker popped open. Sitting on the top shelf, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, was the battered leather spine of Great Expectations. Lincoln's eyes widened with greedy anticipation. He stepped forward, snatching the book from the shelf. He flipped it open. The center pages had been meticulously hollowed out. Nestled inside the square cutout was a sleek silver USB drive. A cruel, victorious smile spread across the Mafia boss's face. Your father was a genius, but a dead genius nonetheless. Thank you, Kaylee. You've been incredibly helpful. He raised the gun. Kaylee didn't wait. As Lincoln gloated, her hand had slipped down to the wall panel next to her locker, the master control switch for the motorized shelving units. She slammed her palm against the red emergency reset button and simultaneously yanked the fire alarm pull station. Klaxons instantly blared to life, shattering the silence of the basement with a deafening shriek. Strobe lights flashed, violently disorienting Lincoln. At the exact same moment, the massive steel shelves behind him engaged with a mechanical groan, sliding rapidly down their tracks. "Dominic, kill her!" Lincoln roared over the alarm, firing a shot. The bullet shattered the tile inches from Kaylee's head, showering her in ceramic dust. She threw herself backward into the narrow gap between the moving shelves just as they began to close. She knew the sequence. They would leave a safety gap of 10 inches, just enough for a petite woman to squeeze through, but far too small for Lincoln or his burly lieutenant. She crawled frantically in the darkness between the towering stacks of historical documents, her heart hammering wildly. She could hear Lincoln cursing furiously, trying to pry the massive steel shelves apart, but the motorized locks held firm. What Lincoln didn't know was that the fire alarm in the archives didn't just alert the local fire department. Due to the priceless nature of the collections, it directly triggered a high-priority response from the Chicago Police Department and the FBI field office, who already had the building flagged due to recent threats to historical artifacts. Kaylee burst out from the other side of the shelving unit and sprinted toward the freight elevator. She slammed the heavy cage door shut and hit the button for the ground floor, just as Dominic rounded the corner, firing blindly. Sparks flew from the metal grate, but the elevator lurched upward, carrying her out of the firing line. When she reached the lobby, chaos had already descended. Blue and red lights painted the grand entrance hall through the large glass windows. Armed tactical officers were swarming the building. "Hands in the air, do it now!" A voice boomed. Kaylee dropped to her knees, raising her hands, gasping for air. "Basement, sub-basement. It's Lincoln Falcone!" she screamed. A tall man in a dark windbreaker pushed through the tactical team. It was Special Agent Heath Reynolds of the FBI's Organized Crime Division. He had been hunting Falcone for 3 years, ever since the tax evasion charges had stalled. "Secure the perimeter squad 2, move down to the basement," Reynolds ordered into his radio. He rushed over to Kaylee, helping her up. "Are you Kaylee Turner? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." She panted, her entire body shaking with adrenaline. "He has a flash drive. It's in a book. You can't let him destroy it. It's everything. The money, the ledgers. My father left it." Down in the sub-basement, Lincoln had realized he was trapped. The vault-like nature of the archives left him with no exit. When the FBI tactical team breached the stairwell, they found the ruthless cartel boss backed against the steel shelves, the silver flash drive clutched in his hand. He considered destroying it, but the red laser sights of 12 assault rifles were painted directly on his chest. "It's over, Falcone." Special Agent Reynolds' voice echoed down the concrete hallway. "Drop the drive. Put the weapon on the floor." Lincoln stared into the blinding tactical lights. The empire he had built, the millions he had extorted, all brought down by a dead accountant and a lonely archivist he thought he could manipulate. Slowly his fingers opened. The silver drive clattered to the concrete floor. 2 hours later, Kaylee sat in the back of an ambulance wrapped in a shock blanket. The rain had stopped, leaving the city streets slick and reflective. She watched as heavily armed agents escorted Lincoln Falcone out of the library in handcuffs. Before they pushed him into the back of an armored transport, Lincoln locked eyes with her across the police tape. There was no warmth left in those amber eyes, no poetic promises of autumn winds or shared literature. Just the cold, dead stare of a monster who had finally been caged. Kaylee pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and turned away. She was no longer anonymous, and she was no longer living in her father's shadow. The ink had dried on her past, and for the first time in a year, she was ready to write her own future. If Kaylee's terrifying encounter with a Mafia boss kept you hooked until the very end, hit that like button, share this intense story with your friends who love dark romance and true crime twists. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling episode. Leave a comment below telling us what you would have done if you found that prison letter. We love reading your theories.